zone where Confederate fire cannot cover all of this ground. As we'll find out up on the top of the rise where the Confederate works are, they got constructed on the true geographic crest of the hill, of the rise. They are not positioned where they can see down the slope fully in their front. This line was laid out at night, and in the darkness, the engineer, Stephen Pressman, did not recognize the full nature of this terrain. And the works were not, their location was not corrected subsequently. And so after receiving some fire from the main Confederate line out in the lower part of the field, as they charge up this slope, they actually go into a zone where they are not receiving fire from the Confederate line. But then, as they charge up the last of the slope towards the Confederate works, they will come again into range of the Confederate line. This is also where the abattis was the thinnest or the weakest. And it is going to facilitate the movement of these troops right up to the Confederate lines. Now, one other thing that is illustrative from this point, if you look to your right front, if you look just in the edge of the woods there, you can see the ground sloping down just a little bit. If you look down the trail, you can see the trail go out of sight, go down the hill. This work is actually on a knoll or point, and as we'll see in just a minute, there is a bend or angle in the Confederate line up at the top of the hill. And the Confederate line actually runs away from us, runs to the east over in this direction. It's following the lay of the land. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get up on the top of the hill. But the right of McCook's attacking column extends over that shoulder of the hill that you see right over there into that lower ground in that direction. Also, beyond McCook is John Mitchell's brigade. And in fact, maybe in just a minute, Dr. McCarley will begin moving his group forward. And if we're here that long and he moves, then we can sort of use them to get some idea of scale of the movement of another formation. But Mitchell's brigade is charging this same direction, but off in that to the south of us. And the Confederate line actually bends back here. That's what creates that salient. And the Federals were aware of it. And so Mitchell, as he charged down that slope, crossed the branch at the bottom, and then started moving upslope, was to begin wheeling to his left to strike the Confederate line that runs back to the east at this point. And each one of the subsequent regiments in his column was to swing out, extend the line further to the right, and wheel up towards the line. So while McCook is charging straight in this direction, Mitchell has actually got further to go, and he is over this shoulder that you see there, and now trying to wheel around. Also, with the 4th Corps attack up here, with Harker's and Wagner's brigade, where they are striking the line, there's a little greater distance between their start point and the line as well. That's essentially going to put McCook striking the Confederate line first. And McCook's men now are surging up this slope right up towards the Confederate main line on the top of the rocks. Let's see if we can get through the dead zone here and
they probably end up being Sherman after. Yeah, maybe it's wall. There's one wall of them.
Confederate occupation of this position on July 2nd. One of the things that we can't always be certain about the surviving earthworks is exactly what was here, in this case, on June 27th. Since this position was occupied for a week afterwards and strengthened further by the Confederates, it's hard to sometimes determine what was constructed on the 28th, 29th, 30th, etc., versus what was exactly here on the 27th. But you now see the Confederate line, and the forward position is right here. When field fortifications are dug, you dig down into the ground, and the worst dirt, the lowest dirt dug, is the last dirt piled on top of the mound. And that dirt, which has fewer nutrients and microbes in it, subsequently supports less plant life. And field fortifications, for that reason, are very susceptible to erosional damage of one sort or another. They survive best under mature hardwood forest cover, which over the years the leaves rot, turns into soil, and you get at least a thin layer of stuff growing on the earthwork. But beyond erosion, the next thing that is the most damaging to field fortifications, short of a bulldozer, is people. And people walking on them. Even walking on them can kill the vegetation growing in that thin layer and expose the underlying soil for erosion. And unfortunately, you can even see the effects of that here in this heavily visited area of the battlefield. But the line is still marked by the trench here. Also, now you can really start to see how the Confederate line runs along the crest of the hill here. This Confederate position was occupied, and it was the Confederate left flank until June 22nd. On June 22nd, Joseph Johnston detected that the Federals were extending their line further to the south. Joseph Johnston ordered John Bell Hood, whose troops had been taken out of the line north of Marietta on the 20th, who had rested in Marietta on the 21st. Hood is to march out and extend the Confederate line further to the south across the Powder Springs Road. That results in the fight here at Kennesaw Mountain, known as called Farm, on June 22nd. But up to that time, this was the left flank of the Confederate position here on Kennesaw Mountain. And partly because of terrain and geography, partly because it is the left flank, the line here is actually bent or folded back. What you might say was the military term refused, bending the end of the line back to protect that end of the line. But also, because of the knoll nature of this hill, the line literally is just following the crest of the rise here. And you can see the mound of earth turning off in that direction. That's what creates this salient that this point essentially is. It also even juts out in front of the general north-south line of the position as it runs northward. We'll even see that a little bit later on. But right here, the Cooks men are going to surge up to the Confederate line. There will be a pause in the advance. The men are winded by the rapidity of the advance. And their formation is broken up somewhat. The right of McCook's line goes over that little spur or shoulder that we see running right down into the woods there. And as that happens, they come under fire from Confederates along the part of the Confederate trench line that runs off to the east and is facing south. But now, with the Confederate line after the 22nd having been extended further southward, there are also Confederate troops off in that direction. And most critically for this Union assault, there are 8 Confederate cannon. Perry's Florida battery and Phelan's Alabama battery. And at least 4 of those guns, if not all 8, many of the federal accounts say all 8 were firing. When you go down and look at that position, you can see clearly that 4 could have fired in this direction. But again, the earthworks are mostly from what we see is from the end of the action here. So they could have been different on the 27th. But the at least 4, if not all 8, of those Confederate guns opened fire. And as they began firing, both shell and canister being that anti-personnel projectile, that tin can full of iron balls, which when fired ruptures and those iron balls sprayed out like pellets from a pellet shell in a shotgun, the right of McCook's brigade is going to shift towards the left to get away from that fire. Where that fire really has an impact on the federal advance is on Mitchell's brigade. Because if you remember, as I said, Mitchell starts off to McCook's right and is moving due eastward, just like McCook's men were. But they knew that the Confederate line bent back here. They could actually observe it doing that from the artillery knoll off in that direction. And so Mitchell's men were supposed to, as they advance, wheel to the left and then deploy to come up against that face of the Confederate line. Colonel Fenstock will go on in his account. Near the top, we encountered the rebels in their strong works, in front of which were placed racks, staked and wired together, the Shavota free, those logs, the holes drilled through and the stakes driven through them. Our men were compelled to break through these obstructions, but after running so far and receiving so galling a fire, in which Colonel McCook fell, mortally wounded, many of them were spent. Colonel Harmon took command and was instantly killed and fell into the arms of his men. Captain Fellows rushed forward, calling the men to follow, yelling, "Come on, boys, we will take," never finishing the sentence. He fell dead a few feet from the ditch. Here's the marker for Fellows. I ordered a second attempt to carry the works and failed. I then sent Sergeant Major Ward to find Colonel Dilworth, who was then the senior officer in command of the brigade. And passing to our right down the line, the sergeant major was wounded. I then went myself and found Colonel Dilworth and explained to him the situation on the left. I found the men nearly all killed and wounded on my right as they struck the angle of the rebel works. The 2nd Brigade, Mitchell's, had retired to the rear, leaving our right exposed to enemy crossfire. I asked Colonel Dilworth what was to be done. He asked me my opinion. I told him we could not retreat, and I did not now feel willing to surrender. So we agreed to separate the men, to make 4 lines, throw up fortifications, while our sharpshooters held the enemy in check. I moved to the left and notified the officers of several regiments to get the men separated and shove up rails and wood. And soon we had a formidable line of works, which enabled us to hold our position. The distance between our works and the enemy was 27 paces. After dark, we rescued many of our dead and wounded. With the realization, with the loss of leadership in Dan McCook and then the second most senior man in that brigade, Officer Harmon, and the realization that they're not going to break the Confederate line here, but recognizing the dead space on the forward slope of the hills, McCook's men will pull back just a few yards short of the crest, begin to reorganize the regiments into separate lines, as Fenstock noted, and then begin to build some fortifications. While some men are firing to keep the heads of the Confederates down, other men begin to pile up the material that they can find, any nearby fence rails, logs, or limbs that they might find, and then with their bayonets and their tin cups and plates from their haversacks, they begin to dig into the earth. Hardly able to rise up any at all, because if they did so, they would rise up out of that protected zone. The Confederate works are not real badly positioned, and so a soldier does not have much vertical clearance, but hugging the ground and then working with what tools they have, they begin to claw out some crude field fortifications, loosening the dirt and then piling it up in front of them. After dark, tools will be brought forward, shovels, picks, and axes, and more extensive fortifications begin. But with just 27 paces between the front line and the Confederate works, McCook's men now are clinging to the forward slope, trying to dig in here out of the immediate Confederate fire. Defending this section of the Confederate line is Alfred Vaughn's brigade, stretching off in that direction. And just around the bend here was the unit junction, the left flank of Vaughn's brigade and the right flank of Maney's brigade. Right in that angle was the 1st and 27th Tennessee consolidated, two Tennessee regiments that had grown weak in numbers and which had been consolidated together. Where I put them in here. One of the Tennesseans at this bend or angle in the line is a man by the name of Samuel Robinson of the 1st Tennessee. This line, in General Vaughn's face, ran along the crest of the hill, but to his left made an abrupt bend to the rear for several hundred yards to the right of Carter's brigade and was occupied by Maney's brigade. When it resumed its generally southward direction, the four right companies of the consolidated 1st and 27th Regiment faced west from the angle and the rest south. This locality is about 4 miles west of Marietta and is known in history as the Dead Angle, from the number of victims to the assault upon it. The ground was favorable for concealing an attacking force, breaking about 60 yards in front of the point of the angle and of its right limb into an abrupt slope which shortly becomes more gradual until it reaches a field. Fronting the left limb, the ground presents a more level approach, sloping away to a small creek, from which point the space was open for probably 100 yards and free of obstruction. From this, a thick growth of trees and brush well leaved out. The picket line conformed to the main line, distant 150 yards at the base of the incline. An 8-gun battery occupied the obverse angle to the left and was so disposed as to sweep the face of the short line. The morning broke brightly. The men occupying the angle after breakfast arranged their blankets across poles over the ditches to protect against the beaming sun. That portion of the works held by the Rock City Guards was unprotected by headlogs. In repairing the damage inflicted by the enemy's artillery a few days before, these important adjuncts of defense were not replaced, and this circumstance added to the weight of odds against us. Shortly after sunrise, the picket firing became very heavy, and we could discern long lines of bluecoats maneuvering to the west and southwest. These, however, soon disappeared from view in heavy timber, and the movement was surmised to back and advance of the skirmishers, simply as had been done on the 23rd. As the morning advanced, the skirmish firing continued to grow in volume, almost amounting to a regular engagement. But the intentions of the enemy were yet unrevealed in spite of the sharp lookout. There was only about 180 men of the regiment in the trenches, a heavy detail being on the skirmish line, and the rest at the wagons washing their clothes. thus reducing the command to one-half its real strength. At length, the lookouts described a white smoke rise from a battery, which completely commanded the angle, and down, down, boys, rang along the line. At the next instant, a shot came crashing through the woods, striking a large tree before reaching the works. Another and another and another followed in quick succession, and the fusillade of artillery and small arms opened and roared along the entire front. Some of the shot were buried in the works, but mostly passed over into the rear. This continued for nearly an hour, but without any casualties to life or limb. About 8:30, the artillery and picket firing ceased entirely, and we were still hugging close to our earthworks, wondering in our minds as to the sudden seeming friendliness on the part of the enemy, when someone called to Captain Kelly that he had heard the command, "Forward," given down the hill. The captain told the men to be quiet and see if it was repeated. "Yes," said Tom Steele, "I hear it, and it is much nearer." Captain Kelly then rose, and removing a blanket, saw two of the pickets running in, and the advancing lines of the enemy but a short distance behind. "Up, up, men! They are charging us!" Away went the blankets and poles to the rear. A small tree, which had been cut down by a cannon shot, had been left across the works where it fell for the sake of shade, was seized and lifted off. The guns were seized, cartridge boxes adjusted, and everything made ready for the conflict as rapidly as possible. On came the enemy, with guns loaded but uncapped, relying on the bayonet, line upon line, well closed up, formed in columns by regiment, 2 brigades being commanded by Mitchell and McCook. The advance was led by an officer of McCook's staff who cheered by the prospect of feeble resistance, called out to his line, "Come on, men, we'll take." The rest of the sentence was cut short by a volley, which came at this instant from the works, and the gallant fellow was cut down to rise no more. His comrades broke in confusion and fled pell-mell down the hill, leaving their leader and a number of dead on the ground. No sooner was this observed than young George Allen of the Rock City Guards mounted the works and exclaimed, "They're running! Come, let us follow them!" His animating words were scarcely out of his lips when he was killed by shots from the woods. He was a brave and noble boy. His high spirit took its flight in a moment of triumphant salutation. The second line followed closely on the first with fixed bayonets, but a still more destructive volley of bullets than had greeted its predecessor tore through its ranks and drove it quickly to shelter. The third line, led by an officer on a white horse, now approaching. The word runs along the line, "Shoot the man on the white horse." He turns his horse to the rear and is seen no more. But on come his men, followed by a fourth line, amid the rattle of musketry from the trenches and the crash of shot and shell from 4 of the 8 guns enfiladiing from the left. These guns opened under the supervision of General Cheatham as soon as the skirmishers got in, a blasting fire on the right of the 5th, 6th, and 7th lines as they halted on the brow of the hill, awaiting the issue at the front. Still forward comes another line, taking our fire stoically, their colors planted in the loose earth at the foot of the works. Above the din of battle, the voice of the gallant Colonel Fields is heard. "Give them the bayonet if they come over," while the work of death waxes warmer and terrific. But here comes the fourth line to aid their wasted and confused comrades of the third line. Those foremost dead lie against our works, trampling over the bodies of the dead and dying which beset their footsteps. Now the artillery comes to the rescue in earnest, and quick discharges of grape and canister cross the front and do their appointed work like so many strokes of lightning. Our colonel, though wounded, still urges his men to shoot for life, and all officers and men stand nobly to their posts, as if the fate of the army hung in their resistance. There was no time to think. Action under such circumstances becomes intuitive and mechanical. The flesh will shrink in spite of the spirit, but the sword of death, and when the front line realized its inability to cross the works, there was nothing to do but to get back, if possible, to a place of safety. So back went the remnant of this line, on and through the fort, which yet held on from the backing it got of the 5th and 6th line. The gun barrels by this time became so hot we could hardly hold on to them.